Well, I'm at 10,000. Like that was my goal. Like my goal was if I could hit 10,000, then that way I can release it. Like I will feel comfortable like letting this loose. You know what I mean? Because I want my best work to go out with this. I want people to be able to break through brick walls. I want people to be able to get closure.
Stories That Live in Us is a podcast that inspires you to form deep connections with your family, past, present, and future. I'm Krista Cowan, known online as the Barefoot Genealogist. I've spent my whole life discovering the power of family history, and I know that sharing the stories that live in you can change everything. A few weeks ago, you heard the big announcement about ancestry networks, and hopefully you also listened to my episode of the podcast with Jen Utley. Well, today, my guest is another ancestry colleague, Nicka Sewell-Smith. And I think she might be our first repeat guest. So that's exciting. I love listening to Nicka's stories, but today she's going to tell a story about the Trask 250. It is a network of individuals who were enslaved by the same individual, and she has managed to trace their descendants in an incredible fashion. And so I'm excited for you to hear her tell about that journey that she's taken to create that network. And you're my first repeat guest.
Oh my gosh.
So that's exciting.
Oh my gosh. Look at us repeating. We're so good at this.
Okay. Well, Nicka, I'm so excited to have you back. Yay.
Yay.
There's so many different stories we could tell and different stories that we could tell together. And that means we'll probably have to have you back again.
What am I going to be talking about then? I don't know, but there are plenty of things to talk about.
But today, specifically, I want to talk about your journey with the Trask 250. And I have kind of watched that unfold a little bit from a distance. And so I know some of the broad strokes, but I'm really excited today to dig into kind of the whole arc of that story for you as research, but then also maybe some of the individual stories that have emerged as you have done that. Mm. So let's dive in. Like, what was the impetus for this whole project?
Well, believe it or not, it started with unnamed ancestors, which I think is something that everyone deals with, right? Like anyone that's beginning genealogy doesn't almost always have all the names unless they're related to us. But just in case you're not, sometimes you ask family members questions and they don't have the answers, right? And, as you're going through the process of genealogy, you want to make sure you're interviewing people because you cannot get that information back once those people die. And so I went about asking folks in my dad's family, like, just for names. And by the time I really started on this, my father had already passed away. My aunt, his sister was dead. Both of my grandparents were dead. And the only first cousin I had was all dead. So I was like a proverbial genealogical orphan in my family. And so I had to rely on my dad's first cousins for like anything about my grandparents. And luckily I had nurtured relationships with these people. And I just remember trying to fill out information about my great-grandfather. And I remember I was going through the steps, I was going through the census, and I ended up finding him in 1900 in New Orleans where he was supposed to be, but he wasn't with his parents. And I was like, well, then who are his parents? And so I called one of my dad's first cousins, and the interesting situation with my dad and his first cousins is that all of them were raised together. They were raised by their grandparents. Mm-hmm. And so, they really more function like siblings than they did first cousins. And so I call Ramona and I'm like, okay, honey is not living with his parents. Like, what are his parents' names? And she says, I don't remember her name. She was like, but I remember going on the train to Oakland to see her. And I was like, whoa. Now, at this point, I'm living in the Bay Area. So I'm like, Oakland, my dad never told me he went to Oakland. My dad is from Chicago, okay? Like, and lived in California. Like, that's it. But this cousin Ramona is she's like a supercomputer. She remembers every day of her life. She can tell you what she was eating and drinking on like January 20th of, 1973. She could tell you what clothes she had. I mean, like it's remarkable the amount of detail that she could remember. And it was crazy because she was telling me about this train ride. She was telling me about how their uncle had gotten them the tickets, how my great-grandfather had taken like a man in like the 40s took two kids across country by himself, and they rode from Chicago on the train to Oakland. And how she remembered my dad was there. They had an older cousin named Maury, who was their uncle's son. And the aunt was named Nora. And I remember this name is like, so like, it's going to keep coming back like over and over again in the story. But there was always an Aunt Nora. I have a ton of Aunt Noras. Like my grandfather's sister was Nora and my great grandfather's sister was Nora. And so she just was like, yeah, she was sick. We came out to see her and she died shortly after that. And Ramona said, I remember the house we went to. The address is this and this on Ashby in Berkeley. And I was like, how old were you? She was like, oh, we were like 8. And I was like, we're in the 2000s. How do you remember this? And so, she was right. Like, she's like, go track down Maury. She said, he's a cartoonist. And I was like, wait, what? And she said, yeah, he's a cartoonist. He has a comic strip. And I'm all in the recesses of my mind, like all these things start playing. I remember being in 2nd grade and having to do a project on Maze's corn and not knowing what to do for this project on this poster board. And my dad said, well, you know what? I'll draw Thanksgiving. And I was like, Dad, you can't draw. And then I literally saw my father freehand an entire Thanksgiving scene. And he goes, just color it in. And I thought to myself, this is like a family thing that I didn't know it was. Like my niece is a makeup artist. Like we have all these creatives. My Aunt Nora was a milliner. Like it's like just super interesting. So I was sort of like blown away. Like, and she said, yeah, she's like, this is his address. She said, look up the address, get the phone number. He's going to know who you are. And I was like completely thrown. So I literally Googled him. And he was a cartoonist. His name was Maury Turner. I miss him so much. He had the first syndicated minority comic strip in the United States. In fact, I think it's still in publication now. He's been dead for almost 10 years. And it was called We Pals. And there was even they even made it into a animated series called Kid Power. And he was still living in his mother's house in Berkeley. And it was crazy too, because I've been on that block. I've been in that neighborhood. One of my very, very good friends, his mother lived there. They were neighbors. And so I just called and I'm like, this guy is not like, I'm hoping he has caller ID. At this point, I wasn't married. So obviously my last name is going to send a note to him that obviously it's someone in the family. So I call, he picks up the phone and Maury has this kind of high pitched voice. He's like, hey. And I was like, hi. So my name is Nicka. And he goes, oh, you're one of Uncle Sugar's people. They called my great grandfather Sugar. We called him Honey. I guess because both of them were sweet. I don't know. So he's like, yeah. He's like, I know who you are. And I was like, Jack. I said, Jack is my yes. So the relationship with Maury is that him and my grandfather were first cousins. And so thus making him and my dad first cousins once removed. So that whole train trip, all of that. And I'm telling him, and he's talking about Ramona, and he has everyone's names. And he's like, oh, and I have some stuff for you here. And I'm like, oh my, like what? So then at that point, like I just kept calling him. And I said, here's the thing. I find Honey and I find your mother Nora. They're on the census in 1900 in New Orleans they're with their grandparents. What is their mother and their father's name? They have 2 different last names. Do they have different dads? What? And he said, I can't remember mama's name. He said, but you know what? Go to Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland. Mama and my mom and my dad, Uncle George and Aunt Nora, he said, they are in this section. He said, the next grave over to them, it's boom, boom, boom. That's where she is. And so for me, I was like, it was all this information just came to me like so fast. Like I was like, what the heck? My family has this history in the Bay Area and I had no idea. And I've been living here half of my life. And I passed by this cemetery every day on Bart. And I had no idea that my great-great-grandmother was buried there. So I head to the cemetery and I go to the office. And the cemetery is so old, they had like the little cards, the little card system. You have to pull it out and they're like, okay, so who would you like to go see? And so I'm like, all right, my aunt's name is Nora Turner. Her husband's name is George Turner. And I knew if I got to them that she was going to be right there. So I walk over and it's gated. I mean, this is like the older part of the cemetery. And this one of the grounds people comes and he's like, oh, you want to come on this side? I was like, yeah. So he lets me in and he's like, well, where are you looking? And he actually literally guided me to where I was supposed to go. And so I went to Aunt Nora. I was like, okay, there she is. That's her. I went to Uncle George. And then right next to her was Easter. And I was like, her name's been Easter this whole time. It's a holiday. No, how do people forget this? But they did. And just that quick, literally getting to her great-grandchildren, that's how quickly her name was forgotten. And I was floored. And I just remember I stood out there and I just talked to her for a little while because it took me 5 years to get to her gravesite, to get to her name. And just the fact that she was like under my nose like the whole time in the Bay Area. And I went through the steps. I knew she died at Agnew State Hospital in Santa Clara. So I ordered her death certificate because I'm like, I want to know who her mother is. And it turns out the household that my great-grandfather and his sister ran in 1900, they were with her mother and her stepfather. And so, just imagine you're looking at the census, you're like, yes, I'm back a generation, but where's the one in between this one? So yeah, it was Letty Reeder and her husband, Smith Reeder, which Smith, he suffered kind of a very interesting death. Before they put in like the proper drainage systems in New Orleans, they had this sort of rudimentary system where like they had planks over like the drainage canals or like the neutral ground. And he fell off of one of them. And like, that's how he died. And like, I'm reading this and it said he was killed by a bad street. Like that's literally the headline in the newspaper. It was strange. And based on his last name, I was pretty sure he wasn't my third great grandfather, but you still have to vet this stuff anyway. So Aunt Nora was a Spears. My great grandfather, Honey, was a Sewell. And then there was a whole other set of kids. There's 3 more kids who had Williams, but everyone stayed in contact. So when I talked to Maury, he's telling me about where the Williams are. So I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is a whole like wing of like my family story that I had no idea about. So then I got in contact with those folks. They were in Danville, Illinois. And like, it was crazy. And that's really how the whole thing started was I didn't have a name and I had to hunt around to go and find it. And I found it in a cemetery I passed by every day.
Yeah. Wow. And Maury, like every family has a Maury, but sometimes you have to hunt to find them. And sometimes you don't have a personal relationship with them. So you have to ask around to get to that person. And the fact that not only was he still available, but that he was willing to talk to you. And it sounds almost like he was waiting for you.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I think one of the things that I'm so sad that I did not get the experience with Maury is Maury loved to draw you. Like that was like his thing. Like it was like a gift that he would give everyone in our family. And we just were always talking about history so much until like, I just never, like, I didn't want to like bother him with being like, hey, so can you like go to work for a second and like draw me? But I never did. And he would do it for everyone. And like, I think he really was waiting for me because there were elements of his story growing up and just being a kid in Oakland and all of that he would like incorporate into his comic strip and like do storytelling. And then he always had a history lesson in his strips. And so it was like, gosh, like it was almost like we were kind of made for each other. You know what I mean? And I remember he just asking like, what do you remember about Easter? And because she came to live with them. And he said, well, we went out to Natchez to go and get her. And I was like, okay, whoa. So at this point, I had this 1900 census. My great-grandfather was born in 1889. You already know what that is. We don't have 1890. So I'm having to like play catch up. Luckily, he's age enough. He's got a World War I draft card. He's living in New Orleans, but his birthplace is in Vidalia. That's in Concordia Parish. That's north. So I'm like, okay, that's a new-ish place for me. So I kind of dug in and I'm just wasn't finding like, I was finding Sewells, but I wasn't sure if they were the right people because I literally didn't know who his father was. And I tried to get the death certificate. I still have not gotten his death certificate, like at all. Like I still don't have it. So I'm like, gosh, like who's his dad? I know his mother is Easter. I know they were in Concordia Parish. Maury's telling me that she lived in Natchez, Mississippi. Well, that's just across the bridge from Concordia. So I'm like, okay, he talked about her dementia. Like she was living by herself. She was a widow at that point. Her youngest children, and her husband had passed. And he said they had to go get her because the neighbors were saying that she was just like walking and doing things. So he remembered driving all the way out to Natchez to go and get her. But he was like, but I had been out there before because we would go visit. We'd take the train. And the train is a really important part of this story because Uncle George, Aunt Nora's husband, was a Pullman porter. That's how they got out to Oakland. And if you know anything about Oakland and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and A. Philip Randolph and all of that, they had a major chapter there in Oakland. And so this is all this history I've been around, like, and I had no idea my family's connection to it. So they would go out during the summer. And Maury was like, he's the kid from California. He's like, why are we going to the country? Like, I don't want to do this. And he said his mother would always meet up with the same people every time. And he's like, it was these white people. And I just was like, why are you coming out? Like, this is weird. Like, why are you doing this? And he said it had something to do with slavery. But he couldn't understand it. And I was like, who are these people? Like, what is this? And so they went and got her, brought her out to Oakland. They had her at the house. It didn't get better. And so then she ended up having to go into Agnew State Hospital, which is how she died in Santa Clara. She was, on her way out. And then that's when the train visit with my dad and my great-grandfather and my dad's first cousin happened. And so, so it was interesting because when I got her death certificate, it confirmed that Letty was her mom. But then there was like a whole, like Letty had a different last name. And that was the other thing. It was like several generations of like different sets of kids and having to reconcile that. It was a little bit of a challenge at first, but I'm so glad that the family helped me like mine through it. And it ended me up in Concordia Parish. And that's where I kind of had to stop for a while because I thought I had an idea. Like I thought I had found Letty in Easter, but I wasn't sure. Like I was like, okay, they're in Concordia. It's 1880. Smith Reeder, who married Letty, is right by. That's like, I'm sure this is them. But when I tried to get back to 1870, it was nothing. So I'm like, were they somewhere else? Like, I don't know. So at that point, you just keep going back to the same records over and over again. Obviously trying to glean new things, trying to see if there's something you missed. And at that point, DNA had kind of come to the fore. And I was noticing on this side, and here's the thing. If people are like thinking that if there are half relationships in their families, that's not like a benefit, oh no, you won the jackpot genetically. The reason why is because you're only dealing with one set of ancestors as opposed to two. So with this, Letty had 3 sets of kids. I come from one, Aunt Nora's set comes from another, Uncle Amos and them come from the third. Anyone we all have in common is connected through Easter. And then it's through both of her parents. So I'm looking at all of our matches and they're going to 3 different places. Some of them are in Concordia Parish, which is where our family was. Some of them were in Point Coupee. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. This is a French-speaking parish. I am not connected to these French-speaking parish people. If you do Louisiana research, it's like very striated into like French-speaking parishes in South Louisiana and then like North Louisiana, which is really like South Arkansas or like West Mississippi. Like culturally, people still speak French, but it's just different. And I'm like, I'm not really, how do I have it's a ton of matches in Point Coupee. Like, what is this? And then there was another set of people in Woodville, Mississippi. And based on this, I mean, you have to think, Easter's born in the 1850s. Letty is born in the 1830s. This is during slavery. And I just kind of mined through. I was reaching out to different people. And one of the DNA cousins, his name is Christopher Alexis. We call him CJ. He was like, could this record in 1870 in Woodville, Mississippi be Letty and Easter? He's the one that asked. And I was like, okay, let me stop being ridiculous and saying it's not possible. The people didn't have cars and they didn't have Teslas that they could like cross the river and like do these things. But maybe it is them. And so I looked at it and the ages pretty much matched. And I was like, okay, I still need more proof. So then I went back to that 1880 census page and I was looking at everyone in all the households. And I said, what if I research these people and find them in 1870? It might give me the clue as to whether or not these are really my folks across the river. Like, could this be a community? Why in the world did I ask that question? And that's how we get to the Trask 250. Once I did that, I noticed that everyone except for my folks on that 1880 census page, they were all recorded together in 1870. The households were entirely intact. And then when I searched them out, I found them all in a labor contract in the Freedmen's Bureau. And it all matched. Everyone was in Ward 1, Ward 2 of Concordia Parish at Blackhawk. Everything kept saying Blackhawk or Cutoff Plantation, Grand Cutoff Plantation. And I said, all right, here's the whole census page on a labor contract. These people are still there in 1880. There's something to this. I look at the landowner on the labor contracts, a man named A.T. Welch, Augustus Trask Welch. So I'm like, okay, it's not an estate. He lived past the Civil War. I got to track down his family. When I traced his family tree, that was interesting because everyone before him was born in Massachusetts. So I said, okay, wait a minute. Maybe I'm wrong. I wasn't wrong. Augustus Trask Welch's generation was the first set of kids in that family born in the Deep South. Everyone else was literally from Western Massachusetts, from Springfield, Amherst, all of that. And they came down to Mississippi through land grants, through service, military service, and they started plantations. And I was like, okay, well, here are all my options. And at the generation above, it was like, gosh, it was a situation you don't want where you're researching enslaved people. It was a bunch of slaveholders who died like right after the war. It was like 1868, 1872. You're like, darn, like, because you want them to pass away before so that you can get the inventory and the will and like all the estate things that would name the enslaved. And so I was like, well, okay, I have several options. Who am I going to pick? Let me pick the unmarried uncle. My suggestion to anyone listening is pick the unmarried uncle or the unmarried aunt because they had to leave their property to someone. And typically it's going to be a sibling or it's going to be nieces or nephews. And that was the best decision I made because when I went through, that uncle passed away in 1855. So it's a whole 10 years before slavery ends. And it was voluminous. He basically had a will where he divided up enslaved people in plantations between a niece and a nephew. And then as I dug further, I discovered he gave an entire plantation of enslaved people to his niece the same month that he died. So I'm like, my goodness, this is like one set population of people and then another two in the will. But go back to what I said about DNA, how we had 3 separate locations of people. And when I got to the estates, that's when I started finding everyone on that 1880 census in the exact same households that they were in 1870 and in the labor contract, and then now in 1855 with the slaveholder. And I was like, at first I was shocked that I was even able to, like, I'm like, what? Like, could this be a methodology? Like, could this be an actual thing? And I don't think I ever really thought about it until that. And what was even crazier was when I went back to all those matches, initially it was 50 people where we were all triangulating together. We were all sharing DNA. Every single time I looked at their trees and I saw where they stopped, I could pick it up another generation beyond just because I had found them as enslaved people. And I was like, this is the golden ticket for all these people. Like, they don't even know. Like, and then I said, okay, now I got to make a choice. This is way bigger than me, and this is way bigger than my individual family. And so, like, what am I going to do? Like, am I just going to sit on this information, or am I going to make it available? Like, am I going to use my gifts to bless other people so that they don't have to spend 5 years and have to end up in the cemetery trying to find the name of Easter? And I was like, okay, like, let me make something of this. And so I was like, all right, I got to name it. And there were 250 people that were a part of that initial will. Like, it was more than that, but that was like the seminal folks. And I said, okay, I tested my theory of, are these households, from the enslavement time period to 1870 to the labor contract, is everything still intact? Like, if that's the case, then if I trace the earliest people, I should be able to find all the connections genetically. And that's exactly what happened. And so now it's to the point where if we get a new match, I already know how these people fit in. Like, I'm like, oh, all right, you were with Musa and Katie or Dunbar. Okay. And for some people, because their folks like never left these locations, I pretty much have their entire family trees. Like, literally. Like, I'm part of me is glad we ended up in Concordia Parish because where our tree would have converged. Like, I would have been a cousin of myself. But it is just, it's incredible. Like, it is, my gosh. So yeah, so the will and the probate, like that was the first part. Then it was like, all right, I have to really get my bearings on this family. Like, I need to know where these slaveholders were, who they were dealing with, who their associates were. I need to know, how much money this operation was. I mean, it literally became almost like a dissertation for me. Like, I was like, I got to know this inside out. Like, what was the motivation? Like, why did they stay down there? Then I discovered that the family papers were at the Mississippi State Archives, and it was 300 folders worth of information. And I was like, oh gosh. So, luckily I live within 3 hours. So I went down there and I pulled slave lists, multiple slave lists. I started going through deeds. I have more than 50 transactions because they were mortgaging against these people's lives every single year. And as depraved as that is, and, for our thinking now, it was also a gift to me because it was almost like a yearly census because they couldn't mortgage against enslaved people that either had, quote unquote, no monetary value, or they couldn't do anything with them. And so literally I had slave lists, I had these deeds, these mortgages, and it was literally a census. And so some of these ancestors, they were born before the founding of the United States, but I have them documented 15 times.
Wow.
Like, literally on paper. Some of them, I have their words, where in addition to the collection that's at the Mississippi Archives, some of the papers were left at Amherst College, and then some of them were left at Harvard. And then it was like, all right, now I got to get that stuff. And I will never forget. I'm like, okay, they don't have it digitized at Amherst. Like, how am I'm like, I can't get to Massachusetts. So I just wrote the librarian and I was like, hey, you have this collection and I would like to get some of the things. And it was mostly letters that were there. Like, all the financial transactions ended up at Harvard, but the letters from Israel, who was James Trask's brother, they ended up at Amherst College. And she's like, well, how many do you want? And I was like, you had the nerve to ask me how many? Oh, here's my spreadsheet.
Isn't the correct answer all of them?
Right, all. So she sent them to me. Now, because of this project, they've digitized all of them and you can get them online. Like, nobody has to and even the stuff at Harvard got digitized too. And so I was just reading through these letters and how does Israel factor in? He's really the one that came down from Massachusetts. He was a lawyer. And he, got licensed to practice in New Orleans in the territorial days. And then he eventually ended up going to Natchez. He married a woman in Natchez, Mississippi. Carter family, very old, prolific family in Natchez. They had a plantation in Natchez. His brother James comes down. James goes to Wilkinson County, Mississippi. Israel's father-in-law passes away. They move that enslaved group down to Woodville, Mississippi. And then their third brother, Augustus, did you see the names keep repeating? So Augustus comes, he buys his plantation in Concordia Parish, and he paid an exorbitant price for it in like 1812. It was like $60,000 or $70,000. It was absolutely nuts. And James ends up basically saving the day for him financially, buys him out. So Israel and James come in a partnership. Around 1822, Israel, I think it's because of his pastor. Samuel Osgood was like an abolitionist. And you read his sermons and you're just like, I don't know how anyone who was in the North living as a slaveholder, because Israel was splitting his time between Western Mass and Mississippi. And I don't know how you sit under that and not be convicted about what you're doing. But not before you open a cotton textile mill, which of course, where they getting the cotton from? Down south. So Israel divests in 1822, and then James becomes the sole owner of these plantations in Concordia Parish, and then the two that are in Wilkinson County. When James passes away, he gives one plantation to his niece, Charlotte. She's married to a man with the last name Venturous. The Ventresses come from Western Massachusetts too. So it's really, I really had to like, it really kind of challenged my historical knowledge. Like, you're like, I didn't realize the North was involved with slavery like this. Like, it's so untold. Like, I don't really think people understand it until you dig into stuff like this. So Charlotte gets her own plantation. I found out later, a year later, Augustus from the labor contract, James Trask is like, here, nephew, here's yours. That became Grand Cutoff. Charlotte then takes some of her enslaved and moves them to Point Coupee Parish, Louisiana. That's how we get the third group. And then now they immerse themselves in with Creole culture down there. And so that's the identity that everyone has. So I just laugh now. I'm like, okay, I made so much fun of everyone else that was researching Louisiana for years because I was like, my people are in those. And I'm like, actually, they are in those parishes. So yeah, that's how you have the three groups. And it is just, the finances of it all are nuts. With there's even a connection to the Louisiana slave revolt. About a year before the revolt happens in 1811, Israel buys a plantation on the German coast. This is while all the other stuff is going on. I mean, we're talking decently early history here. This is 1810. And he mortgages against who I call the elders, or the oldest folks amongst the Trask 50. He mortgages against them in order to buy the plantation in New Orleans. Well, some of those enslaved people on that plantation end up in the Louisiana slave revolt, which is said to be the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. And they get executed by the state of Louisiana. They get decapitated, their heads put on poles that lined the river. And I found the documents for the trial where it's mentioning Israel Trask. Everything is in French. And I'm just like, what in the world did I stumble upon? Like, this is crazy. They even gave one enslaved person clemency. Like, they basically kept him from being executed. And I don't know who that person is, but when you go in and look at the indictment, it looks like it says Saga, who was like the elder. Like, that's my 5 times great grandfather. And I know that he survived because he's the only enslaved person I found directly quoted in a letter by Israel Trask. And it's him asking Israel when he's going to bring his children down to Woodville again so that they can see them. And, he's like, I might die before you bring them down here next time. It's almost like tongue in cheek. Like, are you really going to bring them down here? But we have his words. And he was born in 1773. And like, based on his name and like his wife's name is Fatima, a lot of the elders have African names. Like, they didn't make them change their names. And so, I can imagine someone listening is probably thinking, well, like, have you traced back to like the slave ship these people were on? Trust me, I have tried. The document that I have is where there's a receipt between Israel Trask, his father-in-law, Jesse Carter, and his brother-in-law, George Poindexter, who eventually became the governor of the state of Mississippi. This family is deep. But Israel went to Charleston to go and buy 12 Africans. It specifically says that. It does not name them. And it happened in the year 1805, so that's before the importation ban. I've looked through records in Charleston. I have not found anything. I even went and pulled up articles of just so I knew, like, when they were bringing people in, like, how did they advertise? Like, and they would run these ads for like a month until they sold everyone on the ship. And my thought process is I think that they used a trader, and I just don't know the name of the trader yet.
This is a very, it's a saga, right? It is a sweeping saga that spans generations, and you've done a whole bunch of work, and I have so many questions. Because the story itself is so expansive, and it really, you've just told it beautifully as this arc, but every life is a story as well.
Yes.
And as you start to dig into that, you don't just have your family members as you trace your line back. You've got all the collateral relatives, and then you've got this entire family of white enslavers and all of the people they associated with, including, you even mentioned, like, their religious leaders and other people in the community and financiers and traders. Like, you have such a massive amount of people to keep track of and a massive amount of information to keep track of. And Ancestry has just released a way for people to do that, which is really exciting. But you were doing this before that. And we've together at Ancestry, there's been a lot of us trying to figure out ways that we can help people keep track of all this information, because you really do have to, if you want to understand the sweeping saga and the individual stories, you have to keep track of all that information. Right. So can you give us just a little bit of insight about how you were doing that before these tools came along?
Well, for me, it was spreadsheets. Like, I lived and died by spreadsheets. And when I teach other people how to do this for enslaved populations, that's really the core of what I'm teaching them. And honestly, like, any website where you can search is nothing but spreadsheets. Like, that's what it is.
It's just a database.
It's just a database. And so I had to create my own. And I went through and transcribed every single transaction by hand. And someone listening is probably like, oh my gosh, that's tedious. But it saved me so much time on the back end, because yes, with indexing, we have access to, we can get to information quickly. But if there's 100 names on one image, every time I want to go back to that image, I'm having to bring it up on my computer, zoom in, use my finger, to get, no, I want to do a find. Control F. It was easier because it was bulk. It was a lot of bulk work, copying and pasting facts, linking the images, and then you have to remember, like, for the enslaved portion, that's one thing. I'm tracing these people forward. So it's obituaries, it's marriage licenses, it's death certificates. It's like more than 500 of these things. I have to have them labeled and they're all in the folder. So it's like project managing. Basically, it's project managing the saga.
So you just took a turn that I think maybe not everybody caught, right? Which is, you've spent all this time doing this research back to this original group of 250 enslaved people, back into, the enslavers and that whole community. But now you've turned and you're taking that research and you're saying, okay, now from those enslaved people, who are their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren? Because you got to them through a path, but there are thousands of other paths from them down to how many people?
Well, I'm at 10,000. Like, that was my goal. Like, my goal was, if I could hit 10,000, then that way I can release it. Like, I will feel comfortable, like, letting this loose. You know what I mean? Because I want my best work to go out with this. I want people to be able to break through brick walls. I want people to be able to get closure and, like, pictures and whatever else. And that's also the beauty of this community is, just like how that labor contract had everyone there. And then in 1870, they were all together. In 1880, they were all together. These folks are still living together today. When you look at the census in 1950, the community, it's exactly the same people. It's like no one left. They all stayed together. And now with the descendants, they help me so much. Like, they're like, hey, I just found out about this. Or I'll reach out to them. I'll say, hey, I can send you a report. The average report I'm sending people is at least 20 pages. Mm. And it's going back to fourth and fifth and sixth. We're 10 plus generations with this. And everyone gets it. They email me and they go, I'm overwhelmed. Like, I never thought that I would get this, like, not just find out my ancestors, but have this much information on them as enslaved people.
I love that you've undertaken this and that you're willing to put it out into the world. I think that's amazing. But you come back to where you started, right? It was your great-grandpa, Honey.
Yes, Honey.
And his mother, Easter, and her mother, Letty. How do you get from Letty to Sego?
So that's the interesting part. Easter's death certificate said her father was a man named Daniel Parker. And there is a Daniel Parker who's a part of the Trask 250. Letty's a part of the Trask 250. But DNA was not leading me to any Parkers. And so I'm like, okay, something's off here. Like what's going on? And the preponderance of matches are going back to a man named Sago Haynes in Point Coupee. And I'm like, how is that possible? He's born in the 1830s. Letty's born in the 1830s. They're both Trask 250. But Easter's born right around when the division of the estate takes place. And so I'm like, okay, this has got to be her father, because we've got like 40 matches going back to this man. And so I'm like, all right, well, his name is Sago Haynes. And then Sago's mother's name is Maida. And she's a Palmer. Maida Palmer's father and mother are Sago and Fatima. Mm-hmm. And so that name Sago gets repeated even by blood relations and not. Musa gets repeated or family or not, Randall, Fatima, several people. There's even a set of folks who took the last name Sago. You just keep seeing like it's all this repetition. It's a ton of repetition. And for me, that this is the furthest back, or one of the lines for me, the furthest back I've ever traced. Like to get this early it's not easy, right? And I kind of stumbled upon it, because I'm thinking it's Daniel Parker, and DNA is like, no, it's not.
Well, so as you think to the future, right, you're getting ready, or by the time this airs, we'll have released this out to the public so that other people can find, their Sago and Fatima. Like, what is your hope for this project for the future?
Gosh, I think for me, I want descendants to like walk through life like being like empowered by this information. The impetus for all of our connection is not necessarily like the positive one, right? Like it's not something that people like actively like want to dig into. But one of the things that I find that like continues to infuse me about this whole situation is like they feel so much pride when they discover this. And that's what I really want. Like I want folks to be empowered and to feel like proud that these are these incredible people that we descend from, and that we have this awesome community of people, and that we're like an army a little bit, like with just, that's just the 10,000 I found so far. You know what I mean? Like, and those are direct relations. Like that's not even branching off. That's just those folks and their spouses. Like that's it. And so, and I really want to see, like, you and me both know the record sets that aren't out yet. You know what I mean? Like we don't know the names of those things, but we know that stuff is coming and the innovation that's coming. Like what am I going to be able to do with this, with the amount of data, and it, from a genetic standpoint and from a paper traditional genealogy standpoint, what am I going to be able to do with that? You know what I mean? Like the sky's really the limit.
Well, it sounds to me like you have positioned yourself perfectly to be somebody else's Maury.
I would hope so. I hope I make him proud. Like, that's the other thing. I wish I could just imagine me sharing all of this with him and his rendering of the, like the great cloud of witnesses, like what his interpretation of it would have been. But I guess in the by and by, he is still sort of drawing it. I just haven't seen it yet.
You will. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this story. Thank you for sharing your process. Thank you for sharing your heart, not just with me and the work we get to do together, but with the world, and particularly with the descendants of these people. It's such an important work that you're doing.
Thanks for having me.